What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Body Lock. It's Ant Walker here with Mike Fiedel and Pat Auger. So we've got to discuss a few things that have kind of been rattling the MMA world. As of we're this recording, UFC 250 was last night, so it's Sunday. But the weekend wasn't just filled with drama as far as the fights were concerned. On social media, man, fireworks were flying, and it kind of goes into this overall narrative where it seems to be a general level of discontent among some of the bigger names in the promotion. A lot of complaints about pay, compensation, and whatnot. So let's just jump right into it. Masvidal, Jones, McGregor's so-called retirement, Cejudo's retirement. We had Gray Maynard, we had Cub Swanson. We've had a lot, and former fighters have jumped on this as well, and people have left the UFC roster since. Are the dominoes finally falling? Are we seeing some sort of, dare I say, unionization of fighters right now?
I think at this point it's a little too early to say that, but I would say that this is probably the biggest movement for fighters as a collective in the most recent memory that I can think of. I mean, you obviously had some of those failed groups where you had, Cain Velasquez, George St. Pierre, TJ Dillashaw, meet up with Bjorn Revney to try and kind of had a fighters association and things of that nature. But those petered out pretty quickly and never really went anywhere. This is current big name stars who are being vocal about the issues, saying we're not getting paid enough, and are retiring. I mean, you got Jones, Cejudo, and apparently McGregor all in the span of a couple of weeks. Masvidal clearly seems like he'd be okay with retiring if he had enough money or if he didn't want to fight based on the issues, but he's still pushing to keep going. But it certainly looks like it's the biggest push in a long time. That being said, there's still a lot of hurdles that come with this. Just being certified to be able to unionize from the NLRB is going to be a huge mountain to climb, especially with the current head who's in until December of 2022. He's notorious anti-union. He's done a lot of union busting with the airlines back in the 80s under the Reagan administration. Going to be very hard to get certified in the proper way in order to actually form a union for the fighters, even if this starts to happen. But it definitely looks like it's starting to push into a movement for unionization, and what it ends up being in the end, whether it's a fighters association or an actual union, I don't know. But I would say it seems to be the closest it's been in a very, very long time.
So Michael, I'm gonna pivot to you really quickly here. Jorge Masvidal has been the most confrontational throughout this whole ordeal, and that's saying a lot considering that Jon Jones was butting heads with Dana just days ago, and if I'm remembering correctly, we've talked about that as well. So now that Masvidal has dropped scorched earth, let's kind of get into some of the nuts and bolts of what he was talking about. I mean, we're hearing 8-fight deals being discussed. He's got 7 fights left on it. We're seeing some leftover, things in the air from the BMF title as well. So Mike, if you would do the folks a favor here, just unpack a little bit of what Masvidal was talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jorge Masvidal has taken to Twitter lately, and he's really shared a lot of complaints and a lot of disagreements with the way that his pay is structured and the pay of MMA fighters more broadly when it comes to the UFC. Now, he cited the 18% figure that is from Bloody Elbow's reporting of financials that have been leaked from the antitrust lawsuit, and that essentially means that the UFC is pocketing roughly 82% of the revenue that the entire entity generates, whereas fighters as a collective group are only taking away 18%. Now, Masvidal has taken issue with this percentage, looking at leagues like the NFL and the NBA and the MLB, in which the revenue split is much closer to 50-50 between the owner of the league, the owners of the league, and the fighters and the players, versus the UFC's, where it's more an 80-20 split. Now, Masvidal's in a prime position, as we discussed, to be a voice in this kind of fight. He's someone who, outside of perhaps McGregor, the Jon Jones, as we discussed earlier, and fighters who are in that stratosphere, Masvidal is one of the biggest draws in the sport right now. Of course, the BMF title, the win over Nate Diaz, and obviously the finishes of Darren Till and Ben Askren that put him on the map as far as mainstream concerns. He's done a lot of media, a lot of mainstream media. More specifically, he appeared on SportsCenter with Kenny Mayne and spoke about the pay discrepancy that he believes exists in the UFC, talking specifically about how he believes he is worth more, but his bargaining position with the UFC at the negotiating table is significantly less leverage than they have. Now, I'm on Jorge Masvidal's Twitter right now. I'm going to read one of his tweets. He says, quote, "I'm in a contract that I had to take to get paid. Same way I got a new contract to fight Till, then a new contract to fight Nate. They keep extending the amount of fights to my contract to keep me locked up. And when I say I only want a 4-fight contract, it's take it or leave it. The negotiation is take it or leave it. If I lose, you can cut me and not pay out the rest of my contract. But if I win, I'm not in the position to renegotiate the contract." So this is Masvidal essentially saying, I'm in a position where if I want something, I can't get it. But if the UFC wants something, they can. And I think that speaks to the larger issue here, which is that the fighters as individuals, and of course, as they're currently classified as independent contractors, have very little leverage with the UFC. The UFC has a lot of power. And of course, those in support of the antitrust lawsuit would claim that's because the UFC uses monopsony and monopoly power in order to extort that leverage over the fighters. So this is a very interesting situation, and it's definitely the highest profile group of fighters in recent memory to come out against the UFC in a leverage situation. You've got Henry Cejudo, a 2-weight division champion, now only one at the time, retiring at the age of 33 in what we believe may have been a negotiation tactic. Of course, his coach and manager differ on their opinions of how real the retirement is. Jorge Masvidal, Jon Jones threatened to vacate the title, saying do Jan versus Reyes for the interim belt. Or the vacant title, should he release it. And Sean O'Malley recently came out in support of being paid more to take on more difficult fights. These are fighters who are advocating for more pay for a difference in what they're doing. Masvidal fighting for the title, Jones moving up to heavyweight, and O'Malley fighting tougher, more experienced competition. These are fighters who are angling for more pay for what they perceive to be more risk on their ends. And frankly, I side with them.
It's very difficult to not side with the fighters in this case. I mean, Bloody Elbow did a fantastic job of uncovering a lot of the hidden financials. I mean, these are things that the MMA media was looking for a very long time. I think the closest glimpse we got into any sort of contracts previous to that was when Eddie Alvarez had his issue with Bellator and the UFC as far as what promotion had the rights to his services. So now we're at this point where we are calling into question the business structure of the UFC. Now, the way that Masvidal describes the negotiations seems pretty consistent with the way the UFC president Dana White responds to questions about this very topic. So there seems to be some level of consistency here. When you have Kevin Aioli of Yahoo Sports, he asked him at the press conference about why does he think that this is the case. All these fighters are complaining about pay. It turned into a 4 or 5 minute diatribe that did not answer the question, but was very good practice on how to use the F word. Like it's a very consistent thing here, and Dana has been very, very, very clear on this. You don't have to fight. However, that takes away all the space between two parties coming together to decide on mutually beneficial terms, and that's sort of what we're seeing. We're seeing these mutually beneficial terms not necessarily be mutually beneficial. Now, forgive me if we've gone over this before, but Jon Jones' case, for instance, where they where the example of Deontay Wilder and his $30 million guaranteed purse was used. Well, Dana White's saying, well, Jon Jones is the best of all time, but seems like there's a problem with the business structure. Jon Jones is a bigger draw than Deontay Wilder. Seems pretty logical that he should get the same amount, if not more money If the problem is that the UFC is not used to paying more than 18% of their revenue to the fighters, well, it seems to be a problem with the UFC. Now to have them now point to where, okay, the live gates are being taken away because of the pandemic, doesn't hurt the guaranteed money from ESPN, doesn't hurt the guaranteed money from all the other broadcast partners and the sponsorships and whatnot. And either way, as far as I know, the fighters never saw a bit of the gate money. Let's take a look back to some recent news. The NFL and EA Sports announced they were continuing their partnership for the Madden NFL games at the tune of $1.5 billion. $1 billion goes to the NFL, $500 million goes to the players. Now, when you have the UFC taking advantage of sponsorships, things like that, they have their own partnership with EA Sports. Be very surprised if the fighters got a third of that. We know the Reebok deal is coming to a close very soon. The Reebok deal also was one of the major flashpoints as far as fighter malcontent when it was announced. So I'm at this point, it should be very clear what's going on here. The fighters aren't getting paid enough money. And now we want to point to Jorge Masvidal saying he was getting offered less money to fight Usman than the Diaz fight. You know, even if you want to point to failures in management, if you want to point to whatever the case you want to point to in that, let's be clear on one thing: the BMF title, with these championship clauses, with the amount of money that goes into a champions fight, the UFC created a BMF title. He has UFC, well, it's not gold, but he has UFC medal around his waist that they deemed was a championship that fulfilled whatever obligations they had to put a title fight on the top of a pay-per-view. So why are we now denying Masvidal champion pay? Because it's not a real title, but it wasn't a real title to begin with. So the point is that every step of the way that we go along here, the UFC is always picking and choosing when to do what it's supposed to do, or do it or not do what it's supposed to do. It's always picking and choosing whatever's advantageous to the promotion. However, we know businesses are going to operate to function for their own profit. That's fine. But the fighters, if they are true independent contractors, they are businesses in their own right. Therefore, they are going to operate to their best interest. And it's about time we're starting to see that. So I'm glued to the screen to see what's next. Jorge Masvidal, Jon Jones, Conor McGregor, if this retirement actually means anything. Sean O'Malley, who obviously is a star for the future that they're really looking toward. Keep in mind, this was a guy who, off the Contender Series, had his own T-shirts made. So obviously, the promotion has a serious leaning toward boosting him up. So if you got all these guys mad about pay, there's probably something wrong with pay. Just a thought.
Yeah, and the thing is now, given the UFC's business structure, they've put themselves in a very precarious position, so to speak. If fighters continue to hold out, if they continue to put pressure to the point where, as John Nash said, for Buddy Elbow, who's, again, been studying fighter pay since as long as I can remember, if they essentially perform a strike, because that's really what you're looking at in terms of the next level of this, is more and more fighters, more and more champions, popular fighters decide to not fight or hold out for better pay. The problem is that the UFC, as I've spoken about before, has always been on that franchise business model, has always been about how can we keep our fighter costs down, replicate this system, keep growing our brand, expand the brand, have fighters essentially be just cogs in a wheel. Doesn't matter who they are, we'll find new stars, we'll make new stars. They want to retire. It's Dana White's famous line: if they don't want to fight, they don't have to fight. They can sit out, they can retire. But that's their whole ideal. At 18% of revenue, which includes USADA, by the way, so that it's in terms of what the fighters actually see, it's much lower than that. Now they've accumulated an insane amount of debt from being purchased by Endeavor. They've, had to pay out the investors, as the New York Post reported. They paid out some, $300 million dividend to investors such as Mark Wahlberg and high profile investors that were part of the Endeavor buyout. They don't have the money now to switch from 18 to 15%. It's not that they've got their coffers full of cash and that they can make that change right away without any ramifications. They've, like many other successful businesses, stretched their cash and revenue to the limit so that people are getting paid, but they're not sitting on mountains and mountains of cash. They are leveraging it as much as possible. Originally, I think, for when Endeavor was going to go public before that all fell apart last year. So now, as fighters are clamoring for this 50-50 split, it may be the right, time for the fighters to get together, unionize, get that association together to actually get a fair revenue split. But my big question from a business perspective is, how does a debt-ridden UFC, whose credit rating has been downgraded twice since the pandemic, I don't know exactly the amount of debt, because it's obviously we don't have a full look into their books, but we're guessing it's around 4.5 to 5 billion, somewhere in that range, between Endeavor and what is on the UFC's books itself. How do you, flip that switch so you're giving another, 30% of the revenue now goes to fighters when you're already struggling for cash? I don't see a way out of this for the UFC if fighters make a giant push here, but I don't know how they're going to pull it off either, because they, again, have so many obligations that they have to adhere to at the moment.
The thing is, though, you don't have to necessarily meet the 50%. Like that's what they're starting from so far behind. 18% is nothing compared to most sports leagues. And then you look at the sponsorship payouts for Reebok. You see, however, a gazillion different liquor companies plastered on the octagon, and they see zero from that, while their other sponsorships have been cut as a result. So, I mean, this is it's certainly a problem that Endeavor should be worrying about. It's something that Ari Emanuel might be beating his head against the wall. But at the same time, should the fighters really show mercy in this case? I think not. I mean, and in order to appease them, you don't necessarily have to go that full 50%. If you were to, let's think back to some of Jon Jones' specific words about the Deontay Wilder comparisons. At some point he said, the 30 million, or you're saying what Deontay Wilder pays, or even half. If you meet him at 15 million, still would be under what he should be getting paid, but still be a lot more than what he got paid. So there's definitely wiggle room here, and I think the fighters will accept something, even if they're still being shortchanged. It will be a great improvement if you go from 18 to 33%. I mean, the aforementioned NFL and EA Sports deal, a third of that went to the athletes. If a third of the ESPN broadcast money went to the fighters, would we be having this conversation? So there is a way for the UFC to just suck it up and make the fighters happy to an extent. Really, a lot of the debt issues and whatnot, it's not Jon Jones's fault. So him and Jorge Masvidal and Gray Maynard, quite honestly, they really shouldn't give a damn. Just my take on the matter. Mike, what do you got to say on this one?
Right. So just first and foremost, I think what you were saying, if the UFC were to increase the amount of revenue that the fighters were taking home in any way, shape, or form, even if they don't meet that 50%, that would be great. And obviously, it would be great for the guys like Jon Jones, Jorge Masvidal, Conor McGregor with his third retirement and since 2016. It would be obviously great for them because they'd be getting more money. They'd be being paid more than more than they currently are, which is closer to what they're actually worth. But what that would be the best for is the fighters who aren't being paid, even Jon Jones money, to play on the Deontay Wilder money. The guys who are opening prelims, the guys who are signing to the UFC on their 4-fight short notice replacement deals, for the guys who have to work second jobs while they're in the UFC, even getting up to the top 15 having to work secondary jobs. Obviously, Jeff Neal, the most badass waiter in the world. These are the guys who an increased revenue share would help the most. So I think that's very important. Second, we touched on the problems facing the UFC and their inability to kind of come to the negotiating table on this issue from a debt standpoint. Obviously, the Endeavor debt and any outstanding UFC's debt. Those two things are going to prevent the UFC from giving a larger share to the fighters, outside of obviously the UFC wants to make the most money the UFC can. So they're not going to come to the table on that count. But one thing that I would like to say about the fighters is an all-out strike or anything close to that nature may not be as possible as we think. Obviously, in MMA, paydays outside of the UFC are very rare, few and far between. So there's always someone who's willing to come in and take the existing money that's going out, the existing 18%, because for that fighter, it's their biggest payday of their lives and reliable income. Even though it's not what they're worth being paid. But I think the bigger point is that with the ESPN deal, where the UFC gets a guaranteed amount of revenue for all of their shows, especially the pay-per-views, the fighters are really insulated from how much leverage they have. Back in the day, if we go back to, say, 2016, 2015, a fighter's worth was everything. Conor McGregor was Conor McGregor because he could move units, he could sell pay-per-views, and that was generating massive income for the UFC, who otherwise had a very volatile scale as far as how much the pay-per-view was going to make. I mean, we've seen some pay-per-views that are not cracking big numbers in recent days, but even more so back then before the ESPN guarantee. With the ESPN guarantee, the UFC is able to make a benchmark amount of money for every event. So the individual fighters and how big of a draw a fighter may be is unfortunately something that matters less and less as we look at the new deal.
Yeah, they definitely have lost some leverage with the guaranteed money. But if you have them coming together, and that's a very key thing, and especially the star athletes. Now, of course, as we saw when there was this mad scramble at the start of the pandemic to get people to fill up, cars, no matter where they were going to be, and it was that open call that was put out to managers and on social media that they're trying to find fighters. There'll be people willing to step in, but it took a long time to build a Jon Jones. It took a long time to build a Jorge Masvidal. Like it took time, and it took the right circumstances. And what will happen is the promotion will literally have to just start over. Which, you're gonna have fight fans watching fights, but you're not gonna have the casual interest, which is what the UFC is always after, because that's where the real money starts coming in. I do think that too, that we need to make a clear distinction here, and of course, without us knowing exactly what's on the books for Endeavor or the UFC as its own separate entity, let's be clear that there is and this is a tactic that we see in big business a lot. There's a big difference between losing money and not making as much profit. And that, I think, is the fine line that gets played with here when we hear promotional speak without any sort of documentation to back anything up. So just want to throw that out there. Any last thoughts on this topic before we move it along, fellas?
I guess the only thing I would say lastly on this is, I mean, you're both right in terms of it's not the fighter's fault. This is on UFC and Endeavor, and the UFC is much more insulated than they have been ever before in terms of actual fighter pay and negotiation leverage that they have. But with that being said, I do find it interesting that for two reasons. One, that, as John Nash pointed out, and as you can kind of see with Masvidal, ESPN will get upset if they don't have big stars and big names and they're not getting the ratings or the pay-per-view buys they want. So you could kind of see where Masvidal essentially got a platform after UFC 250 to just talk about fighter pay on SportsCenter. They're already trying to get him back to the table with UFC. They've had him on several ESPN shows. I mean, they don't want him to just go away and lose him. That's already kind of a crack in terms of that partnership, where UFC might be insulated for the term of that duration, but if they don't keep ESPN happy, they're not going to get re-upped, and that's going to be far worse for them. And then secondly, as you mentioned, Ant, you're completely right in terms of the difference between profit and loss. But another big issue that companies have been doing, specifically Endeavor, is so much of them have tried to do these leveraged buyouts where they, just pile on unnecessary debt. That's what happened when they bought the UFC. They took a $1.5 billion Goldman Sachs loan they didn't need just to bring the debt up so that less of their own money was in, because then when they go public and they, are able to sell their stock, they're going to get way more money rather than investing all of their money into the company. And then they have to make up not only what they've invested off of their stock price. Instead, they borrow it from the banks so that they can make more profit in general. So as we go into this, a lot of companies, as we've seen in 2019 in the business world, WeWork specifically might be the biggest one. Their value plummeted to nothing, and they were leveraged to the bone. And so you looked at massive layoffs. Their valuation dropped something like $8 billion or something like that. It just complete decimation. If Endeavor, especially during the pandemic, they're all live events. They have so many live event properties. If they have to give up any money at this point, it's one of those things where you wonder where Endeavor goes. As John Nash said, UFC is fine. They're going to be fine no matter what. But Endeavor, the longer this goes on, the more and more likely it gets Endeavor gets in some real financial trouble. And if Endeavor happens to go bankrupt, then the big question is what happens to the UFC and their fighters? So it's
come save the day. That's my prediction.
They're in trouble too. They had to lay off people at their station casinos. They're not doing great. So
I guess we're all screwed.
Yeah.
Support the fighters. That's all.
Yes, of course.